All right, welcome throngs of expectant attendees. We are again talking about the the year in a nutshell in academic integrity. And I realized last time I didn't introduce myself or my fellow associate deans. I'm Paul Tomascak, associate dean in the College of Liberal Arts, Sciences, and Engineering. And there's also Carol.
I'm Carol Willard. I'm the Associate Dean for the College of Education, Health, and Human Services. Joined by Kristin.
Hi, everybody. Kristin Sotak, Associate Dean of the College of Business and Entrepreneurship, Kobe.
And I guess that's all we have, I think. So we do these breakout sessions relatively frequently just to make sure that people have the opportunity to hear what's going on with the integrity process on campus and if there's anything new. So in terms of the annual wrap-up, there are no surprises. Students continue to do dishonest things, but the lack of surprise really comes in the fact that from a reporting standpoint, most of the reports come from a small number of people in a small number of disciplines, and that's something that we try to fight against because we know that dishonesty isn't limited to a small number of students or a small number of disciplines. So we know that students are doing dishonest things throughout the range of disciplines, and the fact that they are not being reported in various places means that people are either choosing not to report or they're finding some reason to not report. Some of the things that have been reported are very much the same today as they were 20 years ago. Students using phones during exams, students cheating off of one another during exams. There are certainly lots of things related to AI use, or at least suspected AI use. We had an incident of a student appearing to cheat on the math placement exam. We can talk about that if you're really interested afterwards. And the first, but probably not the last, incident of a student being caught using smart glasses in a test situation. And as well, if you're interested more in that, we can talk after the fact. But I wanted to go through quickly the part of the rationale that we're interested in this because we want students to be able to graduate from an institution that holds these values close to its heart. And so students can say to prospective employers that I didn't cheat and I'm at a place that places a premium on students not cheating. From a reporting standpoint, you as an instructor, if you don't report and students are aware that you're not reporting, you are effectively sending a message to them that it doesn't matter to you, that integrity isn't important. And as much as it is a potential pain in the butt to process these sorts of things, it's an important part of the enterprise. For those of you interested in the subject, last year's reading group, or last fall's reading group, I guess, one of the books was The Opposite of Cheating, which goes into a lot of the reasons why students cheat, if it isn't already obvious, as well as ways that you can disincentivize student cheating. So I strongly recommend that read. One of the things we as the associate deans try to do is to make the process of reporting as easy as possible. And like I said, I have no illusions that this is adding work to you by reporting. Turning a blind eye is a lot easier, but when it comes to it, we have made the reporting process as easy as we see it possible to do. So I will go through very quickly that process. 5 fundamental steps The first being consulting with the student. If you catch a student red-handed doing something, student has their phone out on an exam where you've told them that they can't use a phone. Okay, there's not a real huge benefit to talking to a student in a lot of cases, but still giving them the opportunity to say why they were doing this is important. And in particular, in cases where it is less clear what they did, why they did it, you suspect that they used AI to do something, it's really important to have a conversation at that point. In the majority of cases, if you present it in a rational, less than punitive sort of way, students will confess to having done things that they weren't supposed to do. And that leads to a potential productive conversation. So we really like you to have conversations with students about, here's what I found, can you explain this? And go from there. It shouldn't be a conversation of, I found this and here's what the penalty is going to be. You can say, of course, that the syllabus says that I have to penalize when I find these things, but making it all about penalty is generally not the most productive way of doing it. It is good to mention to your department chair that that you're putting in a report that includes an academic penalty, not so that they can try to dissuade you or anything, but in particular, if there's a grade appeal, they're going to be the one who gets it, and it's always better for a chair to be a little bit forewarned of such things. Identify the consequences. This is where you weigh the nature of the offense versus the severity of a punishment. You don't need to penalize. If you think that this is a situation where a student made a mistake and it's appropriate to do something other than giving them a penalty, then that's fine. But reporting is important regardless of whether there's a penalty or not. Submitting the violation report in Starfish, we'll go over that in a moment. Easy. It is stripped down. It involves the least amount of work on your part as possible. And then at the end, you've got to close the loop. If there's a penalty, you've got to tell the student, I've decided that you're going to fail the class because this is just too big a violation to get past. And at that point, they might say, well, I'm going to talk to the president about this. Well, they're certainly welcome to do that, but it would be good at that point to tell them what the appeal process is, which follows the grade appeal process, which is freely available in the undergraduate catalog. So in Starfish, when you go to a student record, there is a flag button in the top left. If you press the flag button, it brings up a drop down, and the first thing in the drop down is academic integrity violation. If you click that, you are given this box, and it doesn't require you to put student information in or anything. It just requires you to put in a little bit of a narrative. And what we like for the narrative is a very brief summary of what happened. Found the student using a cheat sheet on the exam. Suspected that the student used AI because this, that, or the other thing. Just nothing requiring paragraphs of writing. Say what the nature of the assignment is. The student was caught cheating on a series of 3 online homework modules. The student was caught during the sit-down final exam, whatever it is. It's important for us to know whether, when you talk to the student, whether they acknowledged any responsibility, or if they specifically didn't acknowledge responsibility, a good thing to know up front. And in the end, what penalty is being assessed, or if there is no penalty being assessed. You can include whether you've mentioned this to your associate dean. That's not the most critical part. But you don't have to, like with the previous systems, you don't have to include attachments and evidence and everything else. It's good to hold on to those things. Students have the right to appeal into the following semester. So if there's a piece of writing or an exam or whatever else, a screenshot, save those, but you don't have to. You can just put them in a folder and not think about them. Appeals do not happen that frequently, so it's just not critical for you to worry about this at that point. And that's it. Let us help you. We see all of these things. One of the values of Starfish is that when you put in an integrity flag, all of the associate deans see that. The students don't see it. It is something that we see, and we accumulate the information. So if a student who's a freshman has cheated in English 102 or plagiarized in English 102, and then they cheat in Math 104 the following semester, or they cheat in Marketing 250 the next semester, they're classes in different areas, but we see all of them. So we can talk to one another about, hey, this student has cheated for a second time. It's time for us to intercede. And we can apply additional penalties to those students. So if you decided in your course that, well, this was an honest mistake, I'm not going to penalize the student, I'm going to put in the report, but I'm not going to give them a penalty, and they were just playing you and they do something again the next semester, at that point, we can revisit the previous class. We can retroactively enter an XE grade, or we can academically dismiss a student if it's bad enough. So don't feel that you have to do all of those things. Your responsibility is within your class, and let us do the heavier lifting. So I have, as anticipated, sped through this so that if there are questions, we can go through questions. So, questions? Question from the praying mantis in the front row.
Well, I'll ask a question. This is Gwen. One of the challenges I'm finding right now is that it's very hard to prove that someone's using AI. And so I have many suspicions of plagiarism, but it's hard to prove that it is plagiarism because it's AI and it changes every time, even if you use the same prompts. So I'm talking to students about it, but I haven't felt comfortable filing reports because I can't 100% say this person used AI. I'm only 99% certain, and I'm at a loss and will appreciate some guidance.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest single concern that we have at this point. You can do lots of change ups to your prompts and to assignments and whatever. There's a good likelihood that an ingenious enough student is going to be able to flout that and use AI in a way that is not perfectly detectable. I think having the conversation is important. So at very least, if you have a conversation with the entire class early on in the semester and say, look, here's my position on AI, let's talk about it. And then later in the semester, someone you suspect uses it. If you talk to that student at that point, you can sort of reflect on, back in the start of the semester, we talked about this, and I feel that, I just can't get by the fact that this is written in that particular AI style, or, compared to your previous 3 writing assignments, which were terrible, this one is great. Those make that conversation easier to have. The more nebulous, the harder it is, but I think it's still worth having the conversation. And if it's a student who's really trying to cheat, they're just going to dig in and say, well, you can't prove it. This is all my own writing. And I think we're stuck there. But I think if you've laid the groundwork to have later conversations about it and give them the feeling that you're willing to hear them out on what were the extenuating circumstances around this event. Did you run out of time? Did you start to use ChatGPT in an honest way, but it ended up basically taking over your paper? In my experience, at least, a lot of students, if you're putting it in those terms, will be more honest. Whether they get completely honest is, it's case dependent. But other associate deans, do you have any magic words for Gwen?
I don't know if they're magic words, but one of the things that we have been talking about in our college is just talking to the student about the process to complete a certain task assignment, and maybe even showing iterations of it. We've had some professors who do the work, only have the students do the work on Google Docs so that you can see the different versions. And, when you look at one of the previous versions and then look at another version that has a large part of the text, copy and pasted into it. And, some of those techniques and strategies can help students to um, talk about their process, and that maybe they, as Paul said, that they use ChatGPT or whatever they might have used, and it kind of took over the assignment, or they didn't trust they didn't have enough confidence in their own writing or their own thinking. So I think it is an opportunity for conversations around that. And in our experience, some of the students have said, yeah, I did use AI because I'm not a very good writer, and talk about how um, how they might be able to improve their writing, or some steps around that, or redoing the assignment, or providing alternatives for sharing what they know, what they've learned, other than just in a written assignment, some sort of combination of things. Just gonna check real quick. There's some stuff in the chat here.
Yeah, it's the idea that if you're a bad cheater, you're the one that gets caught.
Yeah.
Which is unfortunate, because it means, it tends to mean that if you're really putting your brain power into cheating, you're probably going to be able to get away with it. And those are the ones that we really want to get. The bad cheaters are ones who probably are ultimately more likely to confess that, yeah, I just screwed up. But it's the ones that, and I think that they're rather rare, the ones that are really dyed in the wool, true cheaters, that are going to be the harder ones to find and to prosecute.
I would also add that I think in some cases you can put in the syllabus that for any given assignment that you reserve the right to call a student in and talk about the work that the students did. And so by having the student talk through not just their process, but actually the content that they put into an assignment, to make sure that they really understood that, which ultimately is the purpose of the assignment, that can be another way to deter students, because they might think, well, I might get called in, and call in a few of those students who you may or may not suspect used alternative means to get the work done. So, that's almost like a safety net for you also. Kristin, were you going to say something? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, no, no, you're fine. They're all good comments. I was just going to add that I think it's also just a time of uncertainty for us and for students. I've met with some students who have said that, Kristen, I don't understand. It's okay to do this in one class, but in another class, it's not okay. So I don't understand. So I think we also have an obligation to our students to let them know what is acceptable in our specific class. So at the beginning of the semester, I always talk about, hey, just so you know, I encourage this for under these circumstances, and this is how you can use it. But just always check with your other faculty to figure out, what's okay with them. Because, some people, I think they go into their class like, hey, like this is just obvious what you can and cannot do, but not realizing that other people say like, hey, yeah, use it as much as you can. It's a tool. Other people are like, no, you absolutely can't use it at all. So I think setting those expectations ahead of time and having those open conversations is also just helpful for our students as well.
Yeah. And a shout out to the T for Teaching podcast. The last podcast had the last, or one of the recent ones, I forget, had some recommendations on a method that you might employ to try to help on these sorts of integrity issues. An interesting take, not one for everyone, for sure.
The eyeglass case, the case of the glasses. How, at this point, I think all the glasses only record and they have lights on them when they're recording. Is that what happened in the case that was reported, or?
That was
That's
a
going to change because Google's coming out with a new iteration that
Yeah.
you can program. And at that point, all bets are off. But that won't happen until the fall. So we still have the summer okay. But uh, but that's a bit of a challenge in terms of detecting that as well as, you know, determining
yeah.
that.
Yeah, that was at least one of these cases came from Kobe, one of our accounting faculty members. And, she just felt like she was in a difficult situation because she didn't even think of going to this class, the glasses. I think a lot of us have always been thinking ChatGPT, Claude, things like that. And all of a sudden there's this additional element of the AI glasses. And so she didn't have anything in her syllabus to address that type of AI. So I think that that was also just a learning experience to think that now when we go into our next semester, how do we make sure that our syllabus, the statement that we have about academic integrity, encompasses these glasses as well? But she did a lot of research on them in terms of the different types, what they look like. Can she look at them and see, oh, those are definitely AI glasses? And then if students are wearing them, are they cheating? And so this goes back to, planning for next semester, where she says that she's going to add in there that if you have AI glasses, you cannot wear them during the exam. And I guess evidently you can get them with prescription. And so there'll be also, she'll add a sentence in there that if you need prescription glasses, they cannot be AI. So again, all these things that proactively trying to think ahead to address this, because now in hindsight, I mean, where she goes in the class and the students wearing them and she's like, hey, you can't wear those. And they're like, well, they're prescription. What am I going to do? So again, just trying to think of those things and, navigate this, but also recognizing that, our career services gave away free AI glasses for students. So also recognizing that we are trying to teach students, we are an AI campus, how to use these things ethically. We're giving them out, but then we're saying you can't use them for exams. So I think we have a lot to navigate from that perspective.
Yeah. It just means we'll have to have another breakout session in January. Anything else? Are we out of time, John?
Just about. Any other questions from anybody? Okay. Have we seen any cases of agentic AI here yet?
Not that I'm aware of.
It has been showing up at an increasing number of schools. The California system has had several cases now.
John, what was that? Cases of what?
Agentic AI, where you can create, there are many agents out there that you can program basically to log into your course, give it your credentials, check for any assignments that are due, complete the assignments, and then log out, all without any intervention other than giving it that information. And you can set it up so that would run every week, let's say. So the whole course could be completed without any intervention from the student directly, other than giving it the account password and URL.
I mean, props for them for figuring out how to do the agentic AI and things like that. I mean, that's a lot of, work that
Oh,
only people know how to do. So good
it's a
skill.
simple prompt, and there's lots of videos out there on it. So it's really easy to do.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
and there's also some information on how to do it so that there's pauses and delays, so it doesn't look like everything was submitted instantaneously, which is how the cases have been caught to date. So
Yeah.
new challenges. We got
Yeah. Yep. End of the world.
Yeah, but that's a good point, John. I mean, for when we think about, our syllabus for the next semester, we're just talking about AI glasses, but that might be another thing to either create a broad statement that covers all these different types of AI, or something to also say explicitly, you cannot use AI agents to complete your assignments or to log in and to do these things, which is ridiculous. But but then I know, sorry, tangent. There's a research thing that was conducted where they were looking at national forests, and they put up signs that said "Do not steal like wood from the forest" or something. And they found that by putting up that sign, people actually started stealing wood more often, just because the sign gave people the idea to do it. So I guess just to add that disclaimer as well.
on that note, we'll stop the recording and we'll have some new challenges to consider coming up.
Well, Thanks for showing up, everybody. Thanks, John.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Good job,
Thanks.
Paul.